Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Plastic Recycling Podcast. I have two lovely guests here with me today, Emily, Andrea. I'd love it if you could introduce yourselves.
Well, thank you so much for having us, first of all. So, my name is Andrea Bassetti. I am the senior analyst of the Plastics Recycling Team covering the Americas region. So, what we really do is look at supply and demand dynamics and just really keep up to date on what's happening in the market and report it out.
Awesome. And my name is Emily Friedman. I'm the senior editor for ICIS covering recycled plastics in the US. So very similar to Andrea, I'm looking at supply and demand, but more closely at those pricing and market trends, how they are flowing from bales to flake to pellet across a couple different polymer types.
We're super excited to have you here, two experts who understand the market. So let's get kick-started to both of you is where do you see the current landscape of recycling in the US? Where are we now? I mean, this movement relatively started a few years ago. We're starting to really get a lot of materials in, a lot of demand flowing. Talk to us about the overall landscape in the US of recycling.
Maybe I'll tackle this one first.
Yeah.
So when I think about the various polymer types, maybe we'll start with rPET. In the US, this is definitely the more mature and developed market when it comes to recycled plastics. I mean, all recycled plastics in the US have been around for a long time for various applications, but the use of rPET and those higher, premium quality bottle grade applications has really taken off and gained market share much more quickly than maybe some of the other polymer types. So because of that, there's a lot of eyes on rPET. Right now, we also have maybe arguably the best supply of feedstock for rPET because it comes from water or soda bottles that we're recycling and that the consumer knows to recycle. And from a demand perspective, again, some of those large consumer brand companies, the beverage companies of the world, those are some of the most aggressive in terms of their voluntary commitment. So strong demand pool globally, maybe the biggest supply piece, and again, the most maturity. But if you look at something more nascent like recycled polyethylene, recycled polypropylene, these are two markets where, again, we've been doing it for a long time, but maybe not at that post-consumer level necessarily. Or maybe that material's been going into applications where we didn't even know there was recycled content, different bins, buckets, trash bags, etc. But now we're trying to transition to those products that are right in front of the consumer, that consumer goods packaging. Because of that, demand has been taking off for some of these grades, but at the same time, supply just isn't there. And so these markets are really in transition, trying to figure out, who are my new customers and where am I going to get this material from? Andrea, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, definitely. I think also maybe broadening picture. 2 or 3 years ago, we saw a lot of excitement around the recycling industry. There was a lot of investments that really went in specifically on the mechanical recycling side. And so today we've seen, especially in 2023, a lot of projects, a lot of recycling expansions really wrap up those constructions and open up. And we saw some capacity increase on the mechanical recycling side. And that's really all due to that excitement that happened 2 to 3 years ago. And now finding themselves in maybe a more difficult situation, a softer market. However, on while that's slowing down on the mechanical recycling side, we're seeing a lot of excitement on the chemical recycling side as well, and so a lot of investments happening in that right now, and really a lot of projected capacity growth over the next 4 or 5 years. So the market is still definitely finding itself, finding its shape. And mechanical and chemical are trying to figure out how to work together. So it's definitely been very interesting, and I can foresee the next 4 or 5 years continuing to be extremely interesting and definitely shifting very quickly.
Let's chat a little bit about the supply and demand piece, where demand is coming from the voluntary commitments from a lot of brands. It's coming partially from legislation, and that's very piecemeal state by state. A lot of states just not having any legislation, some of them having some. Talk to us about where do you see that demand curve going in the next year, in the next 5 years? Walk us through that piece.
So what's been really interesting is that in the US specifically, we generally saw a lot of the demand being driven by some of these voluntary commitments, such as the Ellen MacArthur Foundation or the Global Plastic. But what's been interesting is that those goals are meant to be due or met by 2025, which is tomorrow, pretty much.
Hmm.
And so we're starting to see some brands really struggling to fight the premium right now that is out there on the recycled plastics versus the
Hmm.
virgin. And so delay some of those goals, you could say, and push them back a little bit. The main reason there is that these voluntary goals, they're aspirational. If you don't meet them, you get a slap on the wrist, but not much more. And so what's been interesting is looking at the legislation piece, which if you don't meet a legislation or a regulation, there actually is some sort of repercussion. And so the US isn't as strong as we'd like it to be when it comes to legislation. However, we are seeing quite a few bills being passed through, and definitely a lot of focus on EPR legislation, which is that extended producer responsibility legislation, which is just a more intricate model that's going to involve anyone from the material recovery facilities to the packaging industry to governments. And so that's still going to take 2 to 3 years, if not a little longer, to really build those out and implement them. But I think it is exciting that legislation is starting to step in a little bit where these brand commitments haven't really been able to sustain themselves.
Something I might just add on to that, Andrea, is a lot of times we like to think of brand companies as one monolithic thing that, they all have the same goals and the same desires and are taking the same actions. But in reality, there is a very wide landscape of reactions amongst brand companies and how strongly they're continuing to pursue those targets. I mean, some have, in fact, already met the targets or will meet them by next year. Then others, as you both have mentioned, will not. And so that's going to impact each recycler or each pocket of the market very differently because some are going to see that high demand backed by that strong brand and others are kind of left out to dry in that sense.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point, and often they tend to be placed as the evil that aren't doing their job. In reality, there's a lot of other issues, such as lack of enough quality feedstock. The collection sortation isn't where we would like it to be. And all of those are factors that are limiting these brands from being able to achieve their goals. And so it is a much more complex picture that I think is very difficult to describe even in just one podcast, but we really try our best.
Interesting you speak of EPR because we had Rita Domino on our last episode talking about EPR in particular. And we kind of went through the patchwork of where EPR is already present, where it's coming, but definitely seems like a more 5 to 10 year play to cover a majority of the US. So I think this is that where I struggle in particular is if commitments are voluntary and the bottom line, you know, in many cases takes over, how does the impact of virgin come into play? Because in many cases, we're seeing virgin pricing being, 20%, 15 to 20% less. How do you get a level playing field where some brands might be very interested in using recycled materials, but you just cannot compete against somebody who's decided that, hey, I'm going to push my 2025 goal to 2027. And really, I cannot handle a 20% tax or 20% premium on buying recycled materials. How do we get things moving? I think it's something that I struggle with, but that's the challenge I feel on the demand side. Any thoughts on this?
Part of me thinks that it's just unrealistic to think that we will ever see pricing parity just because of the different production costs of these two resins. Starting with a plastic bale that takes a lot of effort and energy to sort, wash, grind, and then extrude. I think it'll be difficult to ever again compete with the petrochemical pathway that virgin plastics are going to get to take. Because we've seen even in times where bale prices have dipped to very low numbers, which might not even be sustainable for the waste system to support. But even then, pricing still struggled to be at parity with virgin. So instead, I think these markets will find other ways to find price parity. And we're seeing that definitely in the US rPET market with imports. It's where they can pull material from countries where that cost of the plastic waste bale and or the labor and production costs of that region are much lower than here in the US. I think that's really hard for the market though, because we want to focus on our own domestic recycling. We want to be doing the right thing and processing the waste we generate, not processing the waste of some other country necessarily. But that is one pathway that companies who are faced with that bottom line have said, this is a way we can still use recycled content, but not put additional financial burden on our products and on our consumers.
This is a good segue into supply then, because when we talk about imports, that's obviously a really, really important piece on the supply side of availability of materials, etc. How do you see imports versus local recycling versus recycling rates, which are still so low in the US? How do you see this landscape and how do you see this moving over the next year, 5 years, et cetera?
Yeah, I can tackle it from a supply side and kind of the considerations that we looked at as we were thinking, between now and 2050, what are these recycling rates really going to look like? And what's interesting is that for the US, we are very aware that imports are going to be supplementing quite a bit. So when you're bringing in waste or flakes, it's going to be supplementing some of that recycling, especially until we have the better collection system, better sortation system, and we can have more waste available within the United States. However, you start looking forward, if you have a lot of flow of waste, which there's a whole discussion there of whether that's the purpose of circular economy or not. But really, we should be looking at a circular economy at the global level, and we can't really be looking at the singular country anymore. But with that increased flow of waste coming in and out, the recycling rates really should begin to improve. And overall, as you start looking at the amount of recycled output into the market as a proportion of the consumption, especially at the different polymer levels, that's going to start to improve. It's going to get better. And we can see it depending on which polymers, of course, mechanical recycling picking up some of that burden for more of the PETs, where that process works really well. And then for chemical recycling, picking up some of that burden when it comes to PEs and PPs. But really those penetration rates, so just the share of that recycled output over the consumption is going to continue to improve. What's difficult about that is that we're aware that virgin plastics are still going to be a big part of the plastics world in general. Unfortunately, given the yield losses and the collection rates, we're going to need some part of virgin plastics to continue going into the market. What's important though is how do we increase the amount of that virgin that we can get back, recycle, and then put back into the market. Really just paying attention at all the flows, imports and exports, but also really focusing on increasing those recycling rates moving forward. And we really think that is a possibility.
Yeah, that's some really interesting data, Andrea, that you and your team were able to analyze on those penetration rates. Something that I would just add kind of on that supply question is I've had really two schools of thought pop up when talking with market participants on where or what will supply look like in the future. Because the current state, as you mentioned, Andrea, our rates are flat when it looks at post-consumer collection. And realistically, they're unlikely to change in the short term without substantial legislation. Even legislation takes time. But there's two schools of thought. One is, okay, if we require demand through regulation or legislation, then that will economically incentivize higher collection through, the private side. People will put in more sortation equipment. They'll be going through municipal solid waste to pick back out the things that us as consumers were too lazy to physically recycle ourselves. So that's one school of thought. The other school of thought is you have to start with the legislation centered around collection, much like the EPR programs you've already mentioned, like bottle bills, which are proven to increase collection rate, but there's just a lot of resistance, again, within industry because of some of the financial aspects or financial burdens of those programs. So those are the two pathways. Right now, it doesn't look like either of those are really on the table yet, but we did just wrap out the fourth session of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee on Plastic Pollution for that global plastics treaty. So maybe at the end of this year, that treaty, if the US does sign on and what that treaty in whole could provide the push needed for us to get either one of those two types of legislation, again, pulling on the demand side or requiring on the demand side or pushing on the collection side. We'll see.
How does chemical recycling fit into all of this? And where do you see that playing a role on the supply side? Given You mentioned virgin is possibly going to be needed for a very, very long time. Do you think chemical recycling can supplement to a huge degree the requirement for virgin in the stream?
Absolutely. I think what's really fascinating about chemical recycling is that it broadens the definition of what quality feedstock for these processes is. For mechanical recycling, you still need waste that is pretty clean in some way, and it needs to be sorted in one type of polymer, and it really doesn't allow for much flexibility there. But what's really interesting for chemical recycling is that it allows for a higher degree of contamination. That isn't to say you could throw anything in there. That's not what I'm trying to say, but you can have a variety of polymers going in, and it really widens that definition of what can be recycled. So right now, a lot of waste that cannot be recycled through mechanical recycling could be picked up by these processes. What we're really seeing for chemical recycling is pretty exponential growth, thanks to all the investments that are going in between now and 2028, which again, 2025 is around the corner, but 2028 is really not far behind. We're seeing a fourfold growth in those chemical recycling capacities. We don't necessarily think all of those are going to go through. We track all of the announcements of any expansions or new plants being brought up. And through that data, so if the real market announcements, these are not our forecasts, we are seeing a fourfold growth. And that's huge. That's going to become in 2028, if all of those go through, something like 22% of all recycling is going to come from chemical recycling. So that's really going to be able to open up and increase the amount of waste that we can put through these recycling processes. Um, and obviously, depending on what kind of chemical recycling processes become more predominant, that's going to define which polymers are really going to be able to go through these processes. So, what we're really seeing is that pyrolysis and gasification, which most often prefer PEs and PPs as their feedstock for about 80% of what's going in. That's really going to put a lot of, I don't want to say pressure, but it's going to open up the availability of recycling of all of the more flexible types of LDPs and LLDPs, of anything that's multi-layered, all of these things, which right now are just not preferred by mechanical recyclers. And so I find it really exciting because even if we might not see all of that capacity that is announced come online, even if we see, I don't know, like 80% of it, that's still a huge increase in capacity. And it's going to really improve our ability to recycle material that right now is just going straight to the landfill.
Chemical recycling, how is the cost structure of production compared to mechanical recycling? And if we're seeing all of this capacity come online, should mechanical recyclers of PE and PP be worried?
That's a good question. I really, and then I'll hand it off to Emily, see if she has more to add. I really don't think so. Mechanical recycling is cheaper. If you're trying to recycle anything that could have been mechanically recycled, it's just you're making a bad financial decision. Let's just put it that way. And so they're not going to be competing for waste because they're just going to be looking for different things. Mechanical recycling is still going to take the really nice PET that's being recycled very effectively through mechanical recycling right now, all of those rigids, and that's still gonna go to mechanical recyclers. However, mechanical recyclers often, when they're sorting their bales, end up sorting out certain things they don't want, and then that ends up going to the landfill. But there's an opportunity there, instead of sending it to the landfill, sending it to a chemical recycler who will happily take a lot of that waste. Meanwhile, those chemical recyclers are still gonna be focusing, again, on flexibles, on multi-layered materials, things that right now mechanical recyclers don't want to be dealing with. Emily, I don't know if you wanted to add anything else to that.
No, I think you covered the feedstock piece of that question really well. The one thing I'll add from a finished recycled resin perspective on pricing is, based on the numbers we're seeing in the market around right now, I mean, these are small volume, it's a new material in the market, these chemically recycled resins. So the prices can be quite high. We're talking a substantial premium to mechanically recycled resin, which remember is already at a premium to virgin resin. And so, if anything, these new chemically recycled resins are putting a new ceiling on the market as to what a brand company or packaging converter is willing to pay for circular resin, for circular plastic, which in theory should help mechanical recyclers because then they can say, hey, we're this much cheaper in theory than chemically recycled resin, and our material will still work for your application, given hopefully it does, and it doesn't meet those specific requirements of chemical recycling. Yeah, that's just one perspective. And with time, as more capacity comes online, as Andrea has mentioned, I think we will see chemically recycled resin pricing modulate some. But for now, it's the expensive one, the new kid on the block, one could say.
Yeah. And I guess the last thing to add there is we're seeing a lot of partnership focus on the chemical recycling side. Mechanical recyclers are used to having waste coming from material recovery facilities, which can be often inconsistent, and they have to just make decisions on the spot. We're seeing chemical recyclers being aware of that, but also being aware that if they want to scale their smaller projects and as they're going from a pre-commercial level to commercial level, they really need to figure out what their streams of feedstock is going to be and secure that before they take that next step. And so we're seeing a lot of focus of partnerships with post-industrial sources and with mechanical recyclers, as well as whatever waste isn't being processed in the mechanical facility being sent over to chemical recyclers. So we're really seeing and hoping that we continue to see this strong focus on partnerships and intake agreements.
Is a big portion of the chemical recycling cost the electricity power usage? And if yes, do you see that coming down over time as they reach scale, as renewables play a bigger part, which in theory are less expensive? Walk me through that particular portion. And who is paying so much money for chemically recycled product when mechanical recyclers in a lot of cases are struggling?
Yes, the energy required for a lot of these different processes is much higher than that of mechanical recycling, because you have to think it's not just the initial process. For example, with pyrolysis or gasification, it's not just taking the waste plastic and breaking it back down into that monomer building feedstock, in some cases pyoil or syngas, etc. But then you have to reprocess that pyoil or syngas through a traditional petrochemical flow chart, flow map. And that's going to take a lot of energy at each one of those steps, the distillation, the hydrotreating, till you get back down to the olefin, the ethylene, and then to the polyethylene or polypropylene. So just that process takes a lot of energy, not just the initial processing of the plastic waste, but the downstream refining of that end product into a recycled resin. And then when you said the second part of that, who's going to pay? So while the resins do cost a lot more, it is very expensive for a company to have to invest resources into redesigning their packaging or their products. From the human capital side to also like the physical machinery, the dyes or the equipment that's used to mass produce those items would need to be reworked. And so that has a cost to it too. So some companies have made the decision, sure, the resin might cost more, but it's still overall cheaper for me to have a drop-in solution that's a virgin, similar material than to have to redesign everything. And then, of course, others are limited by application. So, for example, medical packaging, there's still various applications where it's not really approved to use or mechanically recycled resin. Andrea, over to you.
I think the last thing to add is from chemical recycling, you end up back at that primary material, which means that you can build back up to applications that can be food grade without really having to worry about that food grade application or having it be FDA approved right now. So I think that's also going to be an interesting possibility because you're going to be increasing the amount of raw material available for any food grade application, which right now in the US, I believe is only PET and some HTP. So yeah, I think really following what Emily said, it's going to be a premium product.
Any final thoughts to add about the landscape, about supply demand?
One thing I wanted to throw out there that I feel like people forget a lot is to just look back over the last 3, 5 years and what the markets used to be versus what they are today and the immense amount of change these markets are going through. I mean, people tend to look at the current situation and under today's macroeconomic environment, it's difficult. It's really tough for a lot of folks. But if you think about, again, what these markets used to be, who they used to play to, what the dynamics were then versus today, I think everyone in the industry can be really proud of the positive changes that have happened and maybe then very hopeful that if this pace of transformation continues, who knows what the market of 2028, as Andrea mentioned, will look like necessarily.
Last question for you too is where can our listeners find the two of you? And how can we get in touch with you if they do want to explore some of these topics in more detail?
So you can find us both on LinkedIn. Again, you can search us just by our first names, Emily Friedman, Andrea Bassetti. We both are at ICIS. Also, then feel free to message us and then we can transition things over to email or phone calls. We connect with folks in the market every single day, every single week in various methods: WhatsApp, text, call, video chat. So we'd love to talk with you if you're a player in the space.
Yeah, and we love to throw knowledge out there as much as we like to have conversations and learn from everyone who is in the industry. So we really are welcoming a lot of those discussions.
That's awesome. Well, it was lovely chatting with you both on the wide ranging topic of how the recycling industry has shifted and how it possibly will continue to shift. Lovely having you both. And we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.